Giant Brian, a criminal so difficult to track down that his wanted posters feature only the very top of his bald, shiny head. Sentenced to 10 years for stealing a lifetime supply of Freddo Frogs, a packet of Sour Patch Kids, a bag of Quavers, and a box of potato waffles from his local Tesco Express, Brian had recently been shipped out to H.M.P Offshore, a prison situated on a disused oil rig in the middle of some unspecified ocean. After messing about with a dolphin for a few days, Brian eventually escaped, disguising himself as a bin bag and sneaking his way onto the garbage disposal boat. However, due to the bad smell of his surroundings, Brian began to make sounds such as "Fwah," and "Ooh, it smells horrible in here." As a result, he was eventually found by the police and recaptured. With the boat now sailing back towards H.M.P Offshore Prison, Brian had only a few hours before he would be shackled up for good. But with no intention of playing by the rules, he was far from giving up. No, as always, Brian was going to escape. Ah, what a peaceful snooze. The sounds of the ocean, the gentle rocking of the boat. But no! Wake up, Brian! You don't have time for this! He was trapped in a small cell on the starboard side of the deck. This wasn't good. No windows, no weak spots. How on earth would he break out of here? But oh, it seems they had forgotten to lock the front door. Well, Brian wasn't complaining, and he began to explore his surroundings. It didn't take much time, however, before he ran into trouble. He was on a reasonably small boat after all, and it was packed with officers. This might just be his toughest escape yet. He shook off the initial heat by hiding inside of a filing cabinet. But it was down here, in the bowels of the ship, that he stumbled upon his potential ticket to freedom. An old, broken jet ski. He had heard about these things from a Wii game called Dennis Sports Resort. If Brian could fix this battered machine, there would be no catching him. And so, he decided to scavenge the boat for spare parts. Well, he would have done if Officer Duct Tape hadn't been waiting for him outside the doors. Brian attempted to bash his head with a big stick, but the officer was too tough, and he was knocked unconscious. Waking up in his cell again, Brian wondered how much time had slipped away. Thankfully, there was a conveniently placed bar at the side of the screen. Still a couple of hours to go. No need to panic. But if he was going to navigate this ship in search of a jet ski repair kit, Brian would need a way to travel undetected. He would have to find a disguise. And in a boat full of police officers, what better way to disguise himself than to steal a police uniform? With his new plan in mind, Brian headed back upstairs. Perfect. Officer Spoon was wandering around outside on his own. With his target in sight, Brian made his move, and he hit Officer Spoon with some quick-fire punches, but oh, that didn't really go as well as he thought it would. Oh well, just a minor blooper, nothing to get too caught up about. How about this, officer? Surely this time he could... Okay, what the heck? Was this boat just full of professional MMA fighters or something? I thought this was supposed to be a garbage disposal ship. The truth was, the bin men of H.M.P Offshore were in fact the toughest, most hardened officers of all. And it made sense. You sail a ship of rotten food across the ocean, and you have to be trained to fight off sharks, killer whales, and even a couple of krakens or two. Brian tried to steal a uniform again, but with no luck. He was too vulnerable, and with the time ticking down to nearly half, he was going to have to pull out his special move. He called it the Cranium Shield. Raising both arms as high as possible, he protected his face and left only the top of his bald head exposed. For context, the top of Brian's skull was so tough that it took over a minute to mine it with a diamond pickaxe. With this new technique, the police couldn't inflict any damage on him, and in no time at all, he had stolen a uniform and changed into a devious disguise. Now that he was undercover, Brian was able to search the boat with total freedom, and rummaging through various chests and boxes, he managed to find a couple of bolts and a piece of rubber tubing. This was all a genius such as Brian needed. Nobody knows what he did with those bolts and tubes, but as if by magic, the jet ski was fixed. He pushed it out the back of the ship and zoomed away across the ocean blue. Brian skipped over the waves until he found the shore. He was certain the garbage disposal boat would not be far behind, and so it was to his great delight that he found he had pulled up on the beach right next to an airport. All he had to do was buy a ticket to some far-off place, check in, and spend the rest of his days living a sheltered life on some tropical island. It was the best he could possibly have wished for. His plane seat even got upgraded to business class. You couldn't write this stuff. He had his own bed and everything, and... Wait a minute. This wasn't business class. This was another prison cell. Oh, for goodness sake. Brian hadn't stumbled across an airport. He'd walked straight into a military airbase and got on a police aircraft back to prison. The time before he was locked up for good was once again ticking away. Well then, I guess play the escape music. It was time to break out once more. As before, this craft was packed with officers, and Brian was immediately spotted leaving his cell and chased down. He tried pretending to be just a normal passenger by sitting in one of the aisle seats. Unsurprisingly, this didn't work, and he was even less convincing role-playing as one of the pilots. Time to get himself another police uniform. It took a few tries, but with a combination of the cranium shield technique and a few of Brian's signature punches, he was able to take out Officer Albatross, and he now had free roam of the aircraft. Being the incredible escapist he was, Brian was able to sniff out multiple escape routes in just a few moments. For example, he could just open these doors here and jump out of the plane. Although he wasn't too sure about the survival chances on that one, so maybe he could try take over the controls of the plane instead, then fly himself as far away as possible. But these controls looked really complicated. Giant Brian's brain was giant, but not that giant. The third option was found down in the aircraft's baggage hold, in the form of a large inflatable dinghy. The only problem was, it wasn't inflated. Oh dear, it seemed Brian really was going to have to just jump out of a moving plane. Before he plummeted to his inevitable death, however, he thought it was probably best to at least try and find some equipment to make some form of parachute. Searching every nook and cranny, Brian was able to gather up just enough rope to fashion into some sort of makeshift harness. Lord above, Brian hoped these bedsheets were made out of nylon, as he tied his duvet up at the ends, strapped himself in, and then walked over to the aircraft doors. Brian closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and in a split second, he was gone. I'm just kidding, it had worked! Brian's homemade parachute had worked. He was gliding gracefully through the air and down towards the hallowed turf beneath. As the ground got closer, however, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. A long line of train tracks split the fields below him, and, chuntering along them, was a steam train. If Brian could get on that train, he would be heading far, far away from his pursuers at hundreds of miles an hour. It was an opportunity he couldn't miss, and, in a maneuver only a man of his skill could pull off, Brian soared through the air and landed himself perfectly inside one of the train's carriages. He was away! This time they would never catch him, but... Oh, hang on. Oh my god, you have to be kidding me. What were the chances of this? This was no ordinary train. This was a police train. It was far too convenient. Brian had to be the subject of some sort of sick and twisted prank. He'd gone from police boat to police plane and now to police train. What was going on? But as he stepped out of the carriage and into the desert sun, all of his questions were answered, as his arch nemesis, Officer, stood before him. It was all a stitch-up. Brian was never free from the very start. Officer must have orchestrated the whole thing. His head felt like it would explode. In a panic, he turned and ran. He didn't know what was real and what was fake anymore. As they barreled through the train cars, Brian attempted yet again to use the top of his head as a shield. But Officer was no mere policewoman. She was on a whole nother level, and Brian was knocked unconscious. Just before he passed out though, Brian noticed another presence in his midst. A horse was running at breakneck speed alongside the train. What was going on? Why was this pony in such a state? Probably just another one of Officer Officer's elaborate schemes, thought Brian. But then he realized something. This was his horse, his faithful companion that helped him escape from Rattlesnake Springs all that time ago. Brian might not be able to trust in trains or planes or boats, but that horse had always stayed true to him, and here he was yet again, helping him in his hour of need. There was still hope. Sure, they were on their way back to prison for the third time today, but before that timer ran out, Brian was going to do what he always did. He was going to escape. Taking a baton from a nearby chest, Brian caught Officer Officer by surprise and stole her uniform. He then travelled the length of the train searching desperately for any way he could gain the advantage. He picked up several crowbars along the way until he found himself in the very final coach, where he came across an orange pen and a green pen. To any dumb schmuck on the street, these would appear useless, but not to a genius like Brian. Without a second thought, he scrumpled a tissue from within his pocket into a cone shape, then colouring it in using the pens to create a fake carrot. Before he could leave though, he came face to face once again with Officer Officer. She pretended not to recognize him through his disguise, but Brian knew that he didn't have her fooled, mostly because it was her clothes he was wearing. Instead of chasing him this time, however, they stood for a moment and stared off into the distance. "A storm's brewing," said Officer Officer in an ominous tone. It was a statement meant to intimidate him, but he wasn't scared. She was right, a storm was brewing, and that storm's name was Giant Brian. Returning to his equine friend, he dangled the fake carrot out of the side of the train, waited for the horse to catch up, and then jumped on. "Run, horsey, run as fast as your little hooves can carry you." Unfortunately, Brian didn't know how to ride a horse, but it was okay, for he knew this by now, and he had a plan. Before the horse could take him too far, Brian leapt off its back and onto the roof of the train. Then he combined the crowbars he had picked up earlier into a rudimentary grappling hook. And, with a triumphant swing, he latched around a station post and flew backwards into the desert. As the train swept away into the distance, Brian felt a great sense of triumph. Sure, he was in the middle of a desert with no idea where he was, but he had managed to one-up Officer Officer for the final time, and he would never have to see her face again. Ooh! And then, everything went dark. Brian awoke with his body paralyzed. He couldn't see. Something was on his face. "Latest test subject?" he heard someone say. Oh God, what was going on? Where was he? Who were these people? Brian was in trouble.